Jake Whitaker had always lived a life that most folks nowadays only dreamed of. In his early 50s, with silver streaks in his beard and sun-worn hands, he was the kind of man who spoke little but said a lot. His ranch, tucked just outside the creeping edges of a growing suburb, was a stretch of open land that hadn't changed much in decades, except for the fences he mended and the barns he built with his own 2 hands. Every morning, before the sun kissed the fields, Jake was already out feeding his horses. The dew clung to the tall grass as his boots pressed steady prints into the soil. His dog, Ranger, a loyal blue heeler, trotted beside him like clockwork. Chickens scratched around the coop, cows lowed softly from the pastures, and a pair of hawks circled high overhead. It was a quiet rhythm, a routine carved out of discipline and peace. Locals respected Jake. They knew him from the feed store, the town bar on Friday nights, or the church down the road. He was the kind of guy who'd pull over if he saw your car stuck, no questions asked. Kids called him Mr. Whitaker, and he'd always offer them a firm handshake and a story if they stuck around long enough. He didn't talk about himself much, but those who knew him well understood there was more to Jake than met the eye. But the town had been changing. Over the past few years, suburban sprawl crept toward his land like slow-growing ivy. What used to be empty fields were now crowded with rows of cookie-cutter houses and fresh-paved streets. And with those neighborhoods came rules, homeowners' associations, or HOAs, with their tidy lawns and fussy regulations. Jake's ranch technically sat outside the HOA's jurisdiction, but the boundary lines were getting blurrier by the month. Some of the new neighbors, fresh from the city, didn't understand ranch life. They didn't like the smell of animals or the sound of roosters crowing at dawn. They didn't like the rustic look of Jake's fences or his wide gravel driveway. And while most kept to themselves, a few started making noise. One in particular would soon become a thorn in his side. Jake noticed the shift. He wasn't dumb. He'd lived through land disputes before, knew how people operated when they thought they had a little power. He kept a level head, always did, but there was a look in his eye sometimes, cold steel beneath the calm. A man who's buried fence posts in frozen ground at sunrise doesn't flinch easily. And if push came to shove, Jake wasn't the kind to back down. He still waved at the new residents when they drove past, still offered a smile when someone slowed to ask about the horses. But he could feel the change in the air, like a storm brewing on a distant horizon. And when it came, he'd be ready. Because Jake Whitaker was a rancher, and ranchers know how to ride out a storm. Hey, real quick, if you're enjoying the video so far, make sure to hit that like button, share it with friends, and subscribe for more awesome content. And while you're at it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. All right, let's keep going. It was a warm Tuesday morning when Jake first met her, the woman who would soon turn his peaceful world upside down. He'd just finished repairing a section of his eastern fence line, sweat clinging to his brow and dust smudged across his shirt, when he noticed the SUV crawling up his gravel driveway like it didn't belong there. It was spotless, too clean for a ranch road. A pearl-white luxury crossover, humming low and slow as it crept past the old mailbox that clearly read, "Private property, no trespassing." Out stepped a woman in a bright, crisp blouse, heels that weren't made for dirt roads, and oversized sunglasses that looked more Hollywood than Homestead. She had a clipboard tucked under one arm and a purse the size of a hay bale. She marched up like she owned the land beneath her, pausing only when she was standing just a little too close to Jake. "You must be Mr. Whitaker," she said, eyeing the house, the stables, the chickens pecking in the distance. "I'm Karen Densley, board member of the Oak Hollow Estates HOA." Jake removed his glove, gave a slow nod. "That so?" Karen didn't wait for an invitation. "We've had several complaints," she announced, flipping open her clipboard like she was reading out of a legal Bible. "About smells, noise, unregulated livestock. Your fencing doesn't match uniform community standards, and frankly, the general appearance of this property is unsightly." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Unsightly," he repeated, not in anger but genuine confusion. Karen clicked her tongue. "Yes, this." She waved her hand at the fields, animals, and time-worn barns. "Doesn't align with the image we're cultivating in Oak Hollow. We have aesthetic codes. You'll need to clean this up." Jake stared at her for a long moment. Not aggressive, not defensive. Just letting the silence stretch while the chickens clucked and a distant cow lowed in the background. "Ma'am," he said, polite as ever. "This here's a working ranch. Been in my family since before there was an Oak Hollow. Your HOA's got no jurisdiction here." Karen blinked, visibly caught off guard. "But your land touches ours. You're adjacent." Jake took a slow step forward, not threatening, just grounding himself in the soil he called home. "Adjacent ain't the same as inside. That means your rules stop at my fence line." The sun caught the glint of her sunglasses as she looked back toward her vehicle, clearly not used to being told no. "Well, I'm sure we'll get this sorted out," she sniffed, turning on her heel. "I'll be back. This isn't over." Jake didn't respond. He just watched her retreat, the SUV spinning a puff of dust as it reversed down his driveway. Ranger barked once and trotted up beside him, sensing the tension that lingered in the air. Later that day, at the feed store, a neighbor named Earl leaned on the counter and gave Jake a look. "So, she showed up, didn't she?" Jake nodded, picking at the corner of a feed bag. "Didn't like the smell of my place." Earl gave a low chuckle. "She's already got half the street afraid to sneeze without permission. Complained to the county about my tractor being too loud. She's trouble, Jake. Watch yourself." Jake nodded again, slower this time. He wasn't the kind of man to make enemies, but he wasn't one to be pushed around either. And something about the way Karen had stood on his land, like it belonged to her, like history and boundaries meant nothing, didn't sit right with him. Back at the ranch, he sat on the porch as the sun dipped low, brushing golden light across the fields. He watched his livestock graze, listened to the breeze move through the trees, and thought about the look in Karen's eyes. It wasn't over. She'd made that clear. But she didn't know Jake Whitaker, and that would be her first mistake. Jake had hoped that first visit from Karen would be the end of it. Just a clash of personalities. Something she'd get over once she realized her HOA clipboard didn't carry any weight out here. But as the days passed, it became clear she wasn't the type to let things go. In fact, that first meeting had only lit a fire. It started small. Jake noticed her SUV parked just beyond the tree line near the edge of his pasture. She wasn't even subtle about it. Just sitting there, snapping photos with her phone, zooming in on his barn, his livestock, even his house. At first, he ignored it. Folks had a right to be curious, he figured. Maybe she was just bluffing. Then the letters started arriving. County Code Enforcement, Zoning Office, Environmental Health. Each envelope came with a new accusation. Unregulated waste runoff, improper fencing, disturbance complaints. Jake read each one calmly, sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of black coffee in one hand and Ranger curled at his feet. He knew the land, knew the rules, knew none of it was real. But someone was sure making it look real. He made calls, filed rebuttals. The folks at the county office were polite but evasive. "She's filed complaints, Mr. Whitaker, but, well, none of them have stuck," one clerk admitted over the phone. "You're technically in compliance with all regulations, but she's persistent. Persistent was an understatement. Next, she had a landscaping company show up, claiming they were scheduled by the HOA to clean up the roadside view. Jake had to personally escort the crew off his land, showing them the boundary lines and printed property deeds. They apologized. Karen, of course, was nowhere to be seen. The final straw came one afternoon when Jake drove back from town and found a row of orange traffic cones stretched across the gravel access road leading to his property. A temporary HOA construction road closed sign sat in the dirt like a slap in the face. Jake stepped out of his truck, stared at it for a long moment, then calmly removed every single cone and tossed them into the bed of his pickup. He didn't yell, didn't curse. He just went home and started writing everything down. There was something different about Jake when he got quiet like that. Most folks in town didn't know much about his past, but those who'd known him long enough had their suspicions. There were photos in his hallway of men in uniform, an old Navy trident tucked in a frame, and a folded American flag above the mantel. Jake didn't talk about it. Not because he was hiding it, but because it wasn't who he was anymore. Still, there was a steadiness in him that didn't come from tending horses. It came from training, from experience. Jake had seen worse than a nosy neighbor with a chip on her shoulder, but he knew enough to understand where this could go if left unchecked. Karen wasn't just annoying, she was obsessive. She'd convinced herself that his ranch was an eyesore, a problem to be solved, and worse yet, that she had the power to solve it. That night, Jake sat out on the porch again, the sky a blanket of stars overhead, Ranger resting at his feet. He sipped his coffee, the steam curling up into the crisp air. A soft breeze rustled the trees, and somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted. He'd already called a friend, an old buddy from his time in the service who now practiced law in the next county over. Just to ask some questions, just to lay the groundwork. Because Jake wasn't looking for a fight, but he damn sure wasn't about to lose one either. It was a Wednesday afternoon when the flashing red and blue lights rolled up Jake's driveway, an unwelcome contrast to the golden light of late summer spilling across the fields. Jake had just finished mucking out the stables when Ranger let out a low growl, his ears pricking at the sound of unfamiliar tires crunching over gravel. Two Sheriff's Department SUVs came to a stop just beyond the front gate. Jake took a deep breath, wiped his hands on his jeans, and stepped out to meet them. 4 deputies exited the vehicles. They weren't in a rush, but they weren't casual either. One had his hand resting lightly near his belt, just in case. Jake didn't blame them. When a call comes in like the one Karen had made, protocol kicks in whether it makes sense or not. "Mr. Whitaker?" the lead deputy asked. "That's me," Jake replied, calm but with a hard edge in his voice. "What's this about?" "We received a report," the deputy began, glancing at his notepad, "of potential animal neglect, unlicensed firearms on the premises, and some suspicious activity, possibly related to illegal substances." Jake's jaw tensed. He didn't raise his voice, didn't throw a fit, just stared at the deputy for a moment, like a man choosing his words carefully. "Well," he finally said, "you're welcome to look around, but I'll tell you now, you won't find any of that here." The deputies spread out respectfully, checking the barns, walking the perimeter, even peeking into the tool shed out back. Jake followed along, answering their questions with short, steady replies. His animals were healthy, their papers in order. The few firearms he owned were locked away in a proper safe, registered and legal. The ranch was clean, quiet, and exactly what it appeared to be. After about 20 minutes, the lead deputy regrouped with Jake on the front porch. The others were already heading back to the vehicles, their body language relaxed now. The tension had drained from the scene, but Jake's eyes were still cold. "We didn't find anything illegal," the deputy said, almost sounding apologetic. "Everything checks out." Jake nodded once. "Of course it does." The deputy hesitated, then stepped a little closer, lowering his voice. "Off the record, this isn't the first time we've had calls like this. Same woman. Karen Densley?" Jake's mouth pulled into something between a sigh and a smirk. "Sounds about right. She's filed complaints on at least 4 other residents in the last month alone," the deputy continued. "Nothing stuck. But the calls keep coming. She knows how to toe the line just enough to get us out here." Jake looked out across his land, the horses grazing in the pasture, the chickens scratching in the dirt, the hills rolling quietly beyond the fence. "You boys did your job," he said finally, his voice low but firm. "But I'd appreciate if next time you brought a copy of the report before assuming the worst." The deputy nodded. "Understood. We'll note the situation in our files. If she keeps this up, there may be something we can do." As the SUVs rolled away, Jake stood on the porch, arms folded across his chest. The sun had dipped lower now, casting long shadows across the land. Ranger sat beside him, quiet and still. It was one thing to harass, to complain, even to try and play legal games. But calling the police with false accusations, that crossed a line. Jake didn't just feel annoyed anymore, he felt challenged. And Karen Densley had no idea just how careful you had to be when poking a man who'd spent a lifetime learning how to stay calm under fire. Because Jake wasn't just protecting a ranch anymore. He was preparing for a reckoning. The early morning sun hadn't yet cleared the tops of the oak trees when the commotion began. Jake was sipping his first cup of coffee on the porch, Ranger at his feet, when the panicked bleating of goats shattered the quiet. He stood up fast, instinct kicking in, and grabbed his hat from the hook by the door. What he saw as he rounded the corner made his stomach tighten. Karen. On his land. Wearing oversized sunglasses and clutching her phone like a badge of authority, she was stomping around the eastern pasture, clearly filming. She waved her phone around like she was inspecting a crime scene, muttering loudly to herself about violations and animal welfare infractions. Her presence, loud, erratic, was enough to spook the livestock. A few goats scattered, a horse startled and kicked the fence, and one of the younger sheep stumbled trying to flee and slammed hard into a feeding trough. Jake clenched his jaw and marched toward her. "Karen," he barked, "you're trespassing. You need to leave now." She turned, startled but defiant. "I'm collecting evidence," she snapped. "These poor animals are being mistreated, and I have the right. The HOA empowers us to investigate when we suspect wrongdoing." Jake almost laughed. "The HOA has no authority out here. This is private land, and you just caused a panic. One of the lambs is limping now, thanks to you." Karen narrowed her eyes. "Don't threaten me." "I didn't," Jake said flatly. "But I will ask one more time. Leave, or the sheriff will escort you off." Unbeknownst to Karen, Jake had installed security cameras the week after the false police report. High-definition ones covering the key areas of the ranch. The entire incident, from the moment she squeezed through the wire fence to the injured animal, had been captured. Karen stormed off with exaggerated outrage, waving her phone and yelling, "You'll be sorry for this. You assaulted me. You intimidated me." Jake didn't follow her. He didn't need to. He just turned back toward the barn, gave Ranger a quick whistle, and walked inside to check on the injured lamb. It had a swollen leg, but was otherwise fine. Still, Jake was done playing defense. 2 hours later, a familiar scene unfolded. Sheriff's deputies again pulled into the driveway, responding to yet another call. This time, Karen claimed Jake had grabbed her aggressively and threatened her with a weapon. Jake didn't flinch. He offered them a seat on the porch, poured 2 cups of coffee, and pulled out his laptop. "You boys might want to see this," he said calmly. He played the footage, every minute of Karen trespassing, the animals panicking, and his own measured confrontation. The deputies watched in silence, their expressions growing more neutral by the second. "Well," one finally muttered, "that's pretty clear." Jake leaned back in his chair. "I want her formally trespassed. I want it on record. Next time she steps foot on my property, I want her in cuffs." The deputy nodded. "We'll file the paperwork. You're well within your rights." Jake gave a polite nod, but inside, something had shifted. Karen had made this personal. She wasn't just a nuisance anymore. She was a liability, someone who could cause real damage with her paranoia, her entitlement, her refusal to accept boundaries. And so Jake began to plan. Not revenge, just justice. He started making calls. He reviewed land use laws, dug through his property records, checked easement rights, and reached out to a few well-connected friends in local government. One of them had experience dealing with rogue HOAs. Another was a real estate attorney. Together, they helped Jake lay the foundation for something bigger than a rebuttal. He didn't want to just push back. He wanted to expose her, legally, publicly, thoroughly. That night, Jake stood out by the barn, lantern casting soft light across the yard. He watched the stars come out one by one, arms crossed as Ranger nuzzled against his leg. Karen had crossed the line. Now Jake would draw his own, and this time she wouldn't see it coming. Most folks in town thought of Jake Whitaker as just a rancher. The quiet kind, more comfortable tending livestock than sitting behind a desk. And for the most part they were right. Jake was a man of the land. But what people didn't know, not even most of his neighbors, was that Jake had once studied property law. Not just as a hobby either. Before the ranch, before the solitude, Jake had spent 10 years as a legal consultant for landowners fighting development encroachment. He knew the codes, the loopholes, the language of the law like he knew the smell of rain coming off a fence post. And now it was time to dust off those skills. It started with a call to an old friend, Russell Briggs. A lawyer Jake had worked with back in the day, still sharp, still in the game. They met one afternoon at a quiet diner on the edge of town. Over black coffee and a shared plate of fries, Jake laid it all out. He opened a worn leather binder, thick with notes, dates, and printed screenshots. Each tab labeled and color-coded. He had hard copies of the trespass footage, time-stamped and watermarked. A log of every bogus complaint Karen had filed, cross-referenced with response reports from the county. Even the police visit footage was backed up to the cloud and burned onto DVDs. Russell flipped through the binder, eyebrows rising with every turn. "You've been busy," he said. Jake just nodded. "She thinks she's just dealing with a rancher who doesn't know better. I want to keep it that way." Russell grinned. "Then you're holding a royal flush." Within the week, things moved quietly behind the scenes. Jake didn't make a fuss. Didn't talk about it at the feed store or mention it at the diner. But while he went about his routines, mucking stalls, fixing fencing, he was also filing paperwork. A formal restraining order went through first. Backed by video evidence, witness statements, and a history of unwarranted reports, it passed the judge's desk without question. Karen was legally barred from coming within 300 feet of Jake's property. Then came the civil harassment case. No dramatic confrontation, no shouting matches, just well-documented facts. Every visit, every lie, every consequence neatly compiled and handed to the court. Jake didn't need to embellish a thing. Karen had handed him the rope, and he was simply knotting it. Russell helped draft a cease and desist letter to the HOA itself, pointing out their lack of jurisdiction and warning of further action if the harassment continued under their name. The language was airtight, calm, professional, and razor-sharp. For Jake, there was a quiet satisfaction in how methodical it all was. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't stooped to Karen's level. But the ground was shifting beneath her feet, and she didn't even realize it yet. One evening, Jake sat back on his porch, feet up on the railing, as the sun dipped low over the hills. Ranger lay beside him, chewing lazily on an old tennis ball. Jake sipped his coffee, strong, black, and steady, just like his plan. Karen had poked the bear, thinking he'd growl and retreat. Instead, Jake had smiled, walked back into the woods, and come out holding the law in both hands. The first sign that things were unraveling came on a Tuesday morning, quiet and bright like any other. Karen had just returned from her Pilates class when the knock echoed through her tastefully decorated front door. Two men in dark suits handed her a thick envelope, formal papers bearing the county court seal. She blinked in confusion, then turned red with disbelief. She was being sued. The restraining order, the harassment claim, the civil citations, all there spelled out in neat, unforgiving legal language, and Jake's name was right at the top. She stormed into the HOA office later that afternoon, slamming the papers onto the community manager's desk. "This is harassment," she snapped. "You all need to back me up." But what Karen hadn't expected, what she couldn't have planned for, was that Jake had already beaten her there. Days earlier, he had sent a formal letter, through his attorney, to the HOA board outlining everything she had done. Her trespassing, the false reports, the harassment. He even included the footage and the restraining order. The HOA board, blindsided and worried about liability, had already called an emergency meeting. And Karen? She was no longer the face of the HOA. She was a problem. During that meeting, several board members were shocked to discover that Karen had misrepresented herself, claiming she had jurisdiction over Jake's property when the HOA clearly didn't extend beyond the subdivision line. Worse still, she'd used HOA resources, printing, phone lines, and even a security contractor to support her personal campaign against Jake. They didn't want a lawsuit on their hands, so they distanced themselves fast. Publicly, they issued a statement clarifying that the HOA had never sanctioned actions against Jake or his property. Privately, they launched a quiet internal investigation. It didn't take long to uncover irregularities. Karen had filed expense reimbursements without receipts, and her complaints to the sheriff's office didn't align with the facts. Meanwhile, the neighborhood itself started to stir. At first, no one wanted to speak up. Karen had a way of intimidating people. Subtle threats about code enforcement, icy glares at HOA meetings. But now, with the legal spotlight burning bright on her, others began stepping forward. One elderly couple admitted Karen had tried to force them to repaint their home's exterior 3 times in 1 year. A single mother described how Karen berated her kids for playing too loudly in the cul-de-sac. A retired vet said she threatened to report his dog for aggression after it barked at her through a fence. Piece by piece, the facade cracked. The county sheriff's office launched a formal review of Karen's repeated false reports. Turns out this wasn't the first time she'd cried wolf. The deputy, who had quietly apologized to Jake. He'd made a note after the second visit. By the 4th complaint, they'd flagged her name in the system. Now, those false accusations were being treated as potential misdemeanors. Karen's carefully constructed world of control, of authority, of power was collapsing. And the person who'd undone it all? A quiet rancher with mud on his boots and a binder full of receipts. Jake didn't gloat. He didn't throw it in her face. He didn't need to. Because sometimes justice doesn't come with flashing lights or shouting matches. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a court summons, and a whole neighborhood no longer afraid to speak. Karen's downfall didn't come in one explosive moment. It unraveled slowly, publicly, and with no place left to hide. The county's investigation concluded within weeks, with the evidence stacked neatly against her. Trespassing footage, financial irregularities, and false reports. Charges were filed. She wasn't hauled off in handcuffs like some might have imagined, but a mugshot did quietly appear in the local news rotation one crisp Thursday morning. The HOA board wasted no time voting her out. Unanimously, her access to community funds and privileges was revoked, and the once feared woman who strutted around with clipboards and threats now avoided eye contact at the grocery store. A court also ordered her to pay restitution to Jake for legal fees and damages, and issued a public reprimand for abusing emergency services. Jake, meanwhile, never once gloated. He kept to his ranch as he always had, rising early, feeding animals, fixing fences. But the air felt lighter. Neighbors who once kept their heads down now waved as they passed by on country roads. Some even stopped by to drop off baked goods or shake his hand, thanking him for standing up. Not just for himself, but for all the people Karen had quietly pushed around. Local news picked up the story after the sheriff's office issued a formal apology. A camera crew rolled up one afternoon, filming Jake as he leaned against a fence post, arms crossed, a soft breeze ruffling his hat. He didn't say much on record, just a few words about community, standing your ground, and letting the truth speak louder than noise. The clip went semi-viral. Comments poured in, people cheering for the quiet cowboy who'd outwitted a bully without firing a shot. And as for the sheriff, he showed up personally one evening, hat in hand. Apologized face-to-face for the disruption, the unannounced visits, the assumptions. Jake simply nodded, shook his hand, and offered him coffee if he ever came by again, under different circumstances. Spring came. The fields turned green again. The cows calved strong and healthy. Peace settled back over the ranch like a warm blanket after a long winter. One evening, as the sun dipped low and orange over the horizon, Jake saddled up his horse and rode to the edge of his property. Ranger, his loyal old dog, trotted along beside him. He paused at the top of the ridge, looking down at the little subdivision below, orderly, pristine, quiet now. There was no sense of victory in his expression, just that quiet knowing. She'd picked the wrong man to push. He nudged his hat back, a smirk tugging at one corner of his mouth, and turned his horse toward home, leaving the past behind him, one steady hoofbeat at a time. If you enjoyed this video and want to see the next part, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated. See you in the next one. Your support means the world.